Good evening again, everyone. Thank you all for being here for the second session of Before the Red Dot. In our first session, we explored the idea that Guyana was imagined long before it was inherited, that systems, identities, and structures were already taking shape before many of us even entered the story. Tonight, we move from that foundation into something just as important: the politics that help define how we came to live that story. Because if Guyana was imagined before we inherited it, then it was politics, the movements, the decisions, the divisions that shaped how that imagination became reality. And this is not a conversation about party politics. It's a conversation about political formation, about how ideas became movements, how movements became power, and how those moments still echo in the Guyana we experience today. We're joined by someone who has lived inside that history, not just as a former president, but as someone shaped by the labor movement, by party organization, and by decades of political reflection. Former president of Guyana, former general secretary of the People's Progressive Party Civic, Mr. Donald Ramotar. Thank you for joining me. Tonight's conversation is grounded in a central question, one that still sits with us today. Was independence enough to transform Guyana? Because one of the arguments made by Cheddy Jagan in his book, The Western Trial, is that Guyana did not just need independence, it needed transformation. And this leads me into my very first question. When Guyana moved towards independence, Mr. Ramatar, what do you think people believe independence would actually change? Was it seen as freedom in a political sense or a deeper transformation of society?
Yeah, generally, from the very beginning of the political movement in the 40s, independence was set as an early goal. And therefore, people looked forward to independence. There were some hiccups along the way where different movements developed. Some people fought against independence, but generally, the feeling was that independence will give us an opportunity to develop. As was mentioned just now, you quoted Dr. Jagan, and it was in the one of the early formation of the Political Affairs Committee, that is the forerunner of the PPP, which was formed in 1946. We put that date in November 6, 1946, largely because the first bulletin, the PAC bulletin, was published on that date. And it was founded by Dr. and Mrs. Jagan, Ashton Chase, and Justin Hubbard. And in the foundation document of that, they set as their goal, one, to establish a political party, two, to fight for independence of the country, and three, connecting to the question that was at the very beginning here, that they did not see political independence as the end, but political independence as a means to an end to transform the country where the wealth and the labor of the people of the country will benefit the country itself and not used as it was in the past to benefit the motherland it was called at that time the United Kingdom. So the expectation therefore was that with independence that we are going to be on our own and we are going to develop our country in our interests. That was the thinking at the time.
As I said, our first conversation with Dr. Adams explored the colonial history of Guyana. And I want to go back more pointedly to where we started. Was independence enough to transform Guyana?
No.
And I'm leaning heavily on the arguments of Dr. Jagan here because he said that without transformation of the society or the economy, basically independence was not enough.
Yeah,
So
no.
I'd like to know what are your thoughts now in this moment?
Yeah, that argument is true. And it's not only true for Guyana, but true for all the countries that were colonialized at the time and fighting for independence. That it was not enough, and there was different kinds of struggle. There was the economic struggle where um, the imperialist, the colonialist powers at the time always had a policy of if they're forced to make concession to grant independence, they look for other means to keep control. They will give up symbols, but not substance. And there was that struggle in the economic field, political field, as you know, struggling for trying to control the parliament and the state apparatus as such. And then there was another very important struggle that is not talked about a lot. Um, it's this battle of ideas. It's the ideological struggle. I mean, I am pretty much advanced now in age, but I still remember as a schoolboy going to school having to stand up and sing "God Save the Queen" and "Rule Britannia, rule," rule the waves of Britannia. And if you look at the early PPP in government, 1953, 1957 to 64, you will see that the civil service at that time was not loyal to the movement of the day, to the PPP government and so forth. That they were, particularly the senior civil servants, they were more ideal, they more saw their future with the British colonialists than they saw their future with the new national movement. And therefore, there was that kind of struggle too to change mentality because the British themselves knew that they had to be leaving these societies and they had a deliberate education policy to create black and brown Englishmen to take their place when they were gone. So I would say the struggle was political, economic, and ideological, to use a more classic term, to change people's mentality at the time.
I'm glad you mentioned symbols because we gained independence and indeed we did change symbols. We got a new flag, we got a new coat of arms, a new anthem, and the list goes on. And we were proud Guyanese then, as we are proud Guyanese now. But what were the structures beyond the mindset? What were the structures that remained that engender that fight that you talk about?
What, the structures that
The
remain?
structures that remained.
Well, because of the way we got independence, um, it we under the PVP struggle, the fight was to make some radical changes within the society. But the movement was fractured, as you know, in 1955. And the other section of the movement, if you call it that, first it was called PPP Bornomite, and then later on the PNC, that they saw their future in getting into the government, into power, by collaborating with the British and working with the British and let the British help them to get into power at that time. And then the PPP was defeated in 1964, and we got independence when the PNC was in government. And therefore, that radical break that we had expected, at least in the PPP, that radical break away from colonialism did not take place. That that break started to come slower in a much later period. Um, in 1970, when we moved to become a republic, and some of those symbols began to change. But the radical break that we had hoped to get um, did not come at the time of independence.
I like what you said there. And I think we've all agreed by now that independence was not enough
No.
to transform Guyana. So the real question now arises, and I think we're in the best position now to answer that question looking back. What was needed? What did happen?
But let me say, in qualifying what you said a little bit more, while independent, we agreed that independence was not enough; it was indispensable. It's not it's not that it didn't matter, even though we got independence. Not in how probably the PPP would have liked to get independence, but it was indispensable and it was important. It is still important that we had that independence, because even without that independence, you can't think about bringing about some of the changes that you probably still hope to transform the country by. So I think what is needed is several things needed in our society. We need to continue to work for national unity within the society. We need to work closer together with a vision, with a plan, with a clear idea of what we want. Some of these ideas shift. It's not only that we are able to determine everything on our own, because we operate in a world. We're not a island by ourselves. And what happens internationally has a great impact on us, and we cannot ignore that we work within a certain type of international environment. And those are some of the things the those are some of the areas or the that we have the scope to maneuver within our international context and the national context, how we deal with that. But I think that we have to get closer unity within the country itself, have to get understanding on some of the fundamentals that we want within the society, what we actually need, and to try to purposefully work towards those goals.
We have to commend those who fought for our independence. But looking back now, do you think they were ever truly in a position to ensure Guyana was transformed the way it needed to? And we could also agree that that transformation was delayed in some ways. What
But,
contributed to that?
but that debate was within the PPP um, very early. That up to a few weeks before the party was split, um, Mrs. Jagan was still in prison at the time. Dr. Jagan had just come out of prison, and there was when Dr. Jagan just came out of prison and Mrs. Jagan was in prison at the time. There was a movement within the PVP itself where people were feeling that some members in the PPP were feeling that the British will not grant us back our constitution because the constitution was suspended in 1953. And that for us to get back that to constitutional rule, that we must collaborate with the British, and then they will give us back the constitution. And one of the ideas was that, well, we should try to get rid of the Jagans, that Sidney King, then now Yusuf Quayada, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus, Ram Karan, some of the people who they identified as the radical in the party, and see if they can work with the British to get back to constitutional rule. Dr. Jagan responded to that in an article he wrote in the end of January of 1955. He used to write a column called Straight Talk. And he wrote the headline of that Straight Talk was called The Way Backward. And he was saying, his argument was that the British cannot defeat us if we stay united. And we should stay united. But then he said, let me be generous and give the benefit of the doubt to those who saying that we should make this compromise and get back constitutional rule. And then he asked the question, if we do that and you get political power, what would you be able to do for the people? Because you have sold yourselves. You would have given up your independence. And his idea was, let us stay together as long as it takes. Once we are united and stay together, they cannot defeat us. If you go in that direction, it will fracture the movement and open the people to further exploitation and division, and to make our independence to dilute the content of what we hope to get with independence.
Was that ever accomplished?
Well, yes, because the party was split. Um, it led it to agitation for the. If you go back to the history, it led to the division of the country. It led to a racial division in the population. The division that when the party was split at the leadership level, it was not a racial split because most of the African Guyanese leaders of the party stayed with Dr. Jagan, and two prominent Indians went with Barnum, and that was Jainarine Singh and Lachman Singh. And the two African leaders who went with Barnum was his sister Jessie, who went and came back to the PPP, and she wrote a fabulous book, a little booklet in 1961 called Beware, My Brother Forbes. And she and her boyfriend, Fingal, they went with Barnum, but they came back. But the split, at the ground level, it took on more of a racial division. But the racism didn't really come very strongly until about 1960. Because if you look at the 1957 elections, PPP won in most of the African areas, dominated areas, Chedi Jagan PPP, except we lost New Amsterdam, but it was won by a man by the name of W.O.R. Kendall. And Kendall was ran as an independent. And there were three Georgetown seats that Barnum won, South Georgetown, Jainarine Singh, Lachman Singh, I think, lost his seat, and Andrew Jackson, I think, was the three of them that won in Georgetown seats. So but racism was being stoked from an early period by the British, because when they recognized that they couldn't split the PPP, they started to work on the issue of race. And there's another book that you should buy to supplement your reading. That it's a doctoral thesis actually by a woman by the name of Jane Sillery, called Salvaging Democracy. And she was looking at the British and American foreign policy in the 1960s, and she used British Guyana as a case study. And she had access to a lot of information, some of which we still don't have access to. And she quoted a letter written by then Governor of Guyana, Sir Patrick Renderson, in 1959, when his tenure was coming to an end. And in it, he wrote, one of his tasks was to split the PPP and divide the PPP. And he said that he thinks that he has succeeded in making Barnum acceptable, or making him coming to be a chief minister. But unfortunately, his words, it was done at the expense of race relations within the society, which showed you that the race was engineered with him. And while I accept that, I know a lot of my friends sometimes in the PNC accept that as well, that the colonialists started the engineering. What they don't want to talk about is those Guyanese who collaborated with the British, which I feel they were just as guilty as the British in doing that.
Mr. Ramotar, you've been very helpful in helping me to take this conversation in the direction that I'm going, because we've spoken about the domestic fight and challenges, but I really want to talk about the external influence. And you pointed correctly to how it stoked racial division. But beyond that, how did the external forces at the time, particularly from Britain, the United States, really influence what we were trying to do in terms of transforming Guyana now that we had gained independence? What did that external influence look like at the time?
Now, let me see. I don't know if I'll capture all that you asked, but let me try. There was one, the British did everything to try to destroy the PPP at a very early stage. Their objective was always to destroy the PPP. And having failed that, the idea first that they had with Barnum was him to take over the PPP. And having failed that, he split the PPP. So then to move on to build the movement, they started to concentrate heavily on the racial issue to gain popularity and to gain support among the masses. Um, that was how they kind of evolved, but they were having a hard time because, as I said, up to 1964, when the PPP came out of government, more than 1/3 of the membership of the PPP was still Afro-Guyanese, and the leadership, we still had a large bunch of the leadership being Afro-Guyanese. Many of them who were severely beaten. The black leaders in the PPP suffered quite a lot because in order to try to expose racism within the society, there was this attempt to strip the PPP of African leadership. And they did it by two ways, either trying to bribe them or to beat them out of it by force. So a lot of people suffered. Brindley Ben, E.M.G. Wilson, several other people, leadership of the party struggled up to come with Cyril Belgrave, many of those that some of them know. So it was that kind of division that still persists in the society that we have to deal with. My own view on some of those things, I still believe, although we have having this problem for a long time and some of it has become sunk in our minds in some ways, but I still believe that it is skin deep. Because if you look at racism throughout the world, there's always an economic underpinning of racism. In South Africa, it was discriminating against black people, exploiting black people so that white people could live better. In the United States, during the period of segregation, same thinking. And all over the world you look at, it's the same thing. In Guyana, it was different in a way. Different in several ways, in the sense that today, even though the majority of rich people in this country are Indians, the vast majority of Indians don't live better off than the vast majority of black people. And the other thing too, unlike let's say South Africa, where it was more nakedly exposed, or Southern Africa, in Guyana, it was disguised in many ways. Indians was a perfect, for want of a better word, a perfect patsy for the people who were really making the money within the country. Because I saw a film once, and the line stuck with me. You know, you saw this film, The Silence of the Lambs. There was one part when the killer was guiding the young detective into how to find the killer that she was looking for. She said, envy. What do you envy? You envy the things that you see every day near to you, that maybe your neighbor doing a little bit better and so forth. But I think it's the same role Indian played in the society. Because if you examine our society at the time, the people who were making the bulk of the money were the whites, Bookers, Demba, Reynolds, and other big people. But the people the Indians who were the small business people, and they were forced into business in many ways, the Indians, because if you look at our state structure at the time, at the top of it was the British, whites, then just below them was the colored and Portuguese, and then below that were the Africans who took up the whole state structure. So when slavery was abolished, Africans came, they had education, they got into these jobs. When indentureship was abolished, there was no place in the structure for Indians. So they were forced into small business and they were forced into the professions. And some of them started to do well and started to do better. And they were my neighbor, and I see them doing better. And maybe some of that little jealousy arose. And that was a perfect foil to disguise the people who are really to protect the people who are really making the money within the society. That the hostility didn't go to the real exploiters, but it was stopped in a different way. That's another role that race played within the society itself. So I say it's skin deep. One, the Indians who did well in the country, a lot of them did it by the dint of very hard work, a lot of sacrifice and so forth. They didn't go and seize people's lands. They didn't seize people's property and did well. And a lot of them were very strongly what I will call national bourgeoisie, because the bourgeois class itself was not a monolithic class. The old bourgeois class in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, were fundamentally strongly supporting the British, the whites and the finance and all of that. They were strongly in support of the British. And they were opposed to the rising Indian bourgeoisie that was developing for two reasons. One, they were opposed to them because they were now competing with them. And the second reason is because that this rising bourgeoisie was more national oriented. And that is why a lot of them supported the PPP, because the PPP began to kind of protect them in order for them to develop and to grow. Like when I say protect them, like let me take, for instance, when Kissoon started their factory in the 1950s, then the PPP put heavier tax on importation of furniture so that it can help the local business to grow and that type of thing. And therefore, the PPP had strong support from the new rising bourgeoisie, which was excluded from the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce, which was controlled fundamentally by the whites and so forth. And they had to form another Chamber of Commerce, which they called themselves the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And that Junior Chamber of Commerce was strongly in support of the PPP. So I would say that, how to put it, I think I get lost in the question.
If I could help you to reach a conclusion, I'd ask the question this way. Would you say it's a correct conclusion of yours that the racial division that emerged then and still affect us now had less to do with our colonial past and what we inherited and more to do with the external forces at the time?
I think I don't think you can exclude it. I don't think you can divorce it. I think it has a lot to do with the colonial past. There's also some other ideas that was planted that took root in some ways. There was a feeling of entitlement, I believe, developed, that the African Guyanese who came here earlier, who were were the slaves who did a lot of work and so forth. Then also they were the ones who were forced educated and so forth. They kind of developed, through the encouragement of the British, they kind of developed a feeling of entitlement that we were here first and therefore we should replace the whites in different positions and so forth. And that was done through an organization called the League of Colored People. There were two, before the PPP came into existence, you had the League of Colored People that was kind of looking after black middle class interests, not the masses of black people. And then they had the British Guyana East Indian Association that did the same thing with the Indians, trying to fight for space within the society, within the structures themselves. So I think it was both encouraged, that from the colonial past, had nothing to do with our present day politics in a way, but it was even there from before, but it took on a more pronounced position as as British colonialism was challenged, then it took on a stronger kind of position in that way.
You mentioned Jane Sillery earlier,
Hmm.
and she argues that Guyana became a Cold War battleground,
Hmm.
that decisions about her political future were influenced more by global fears than local realities. Is that an argument that you agree with?
That is, yeah, at some extent, yes, I agree with her, Larry, because there was some very interesting evolution of thinking, I believe, at the time. The whole idea that the British had was to crush the PPP. And when they allowed the PPP to go into the government in 1957, part of the idea was to crush the PPP, was to use the PPP in government to make it unpopular. And that was to frustrate all their plans, to make them put them in government, but not able to achieve anything in the sense that they will hope to make them unpopular in that regard. But the PPP, I think, in a way, you show the creativity of the party at that time, and the dedication of the comrades who were running the party at that time, despite the fact that they were starved of resources. They used a lot of organizational methods to do things that allow them to become extreme in the context, in the position that they were operating in, that they became very successful. So much so that at one time in the 50s, the late 50s, from 57 to 61, the British were saying, when the Americans were pressuring them as the Cold War factor came into consideration, particularly after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and pressing to change, to suspend the Constitution and kick out Jagan again, the British were saying that there is no alternative to this man. And I would say no, first time I'm going to say this, this idea that was in my mind for a while, that the PPP working with the British had an impact on the British because when they were outside of the government, they saw them as little nuisance running around the place, communists making a lot of noise and so forth. But seeing what they were doing and what they were achieving with such limited resources, they were telling the British, the Americans, these people are not doing anything communistic. In fact, Ralph Gray, one time in answering one of the American pressure, he said, you were mistaking Jagan's nationalism for communism and give the people a chance. But the Americans were not prepared to give the PPP a chance, particularly after the Cuban Revolution, and they started to intensify in 1957 to 61, they used the method of starving the PPP of resources in order to defeat them and make them unpopular. But when the PPP won the 1961 elections alone, that's when they turned to violence. And from 1962, they started the violence within the society. So I would think that is some of the evolution that we have to look at within the society. That the society was moving. One of the things that struck me, if you go back into the 40s and so forth, and the early 50s, before the PPP got into government in 53 and so, you will see many of the reports that was written by the colonial powers. They were saying poverty was so much in this country, so much that it was unbelievable. Then one woman, she was from the World Health Organization. She said she never saw such poverty that she saw here, and you will never see such poverty in the rest of the Caribbean, in Jamaica and Trinidad and so forth. And by 1963-64, Peter Newman, who's a professor, wrote a book, and he said the poverty that you will see in Jamaica and in Trinidad, you will never see it in British Guyana. And that, in a way, gives you a glimpse of how much the PPP did. And it definitely had to have an impact on those British administrators who worked closely with them. And they were saying, give these people a chance. But then they gave up. After 1962, they gave up. They said the country going to get independence. It's going to be an American problem anyhow, so let me just go along with what the Americans want to do. But they didn't really agree. There was a certain, in my view, there was a certain evolution of their thinking as well. They were not unaffected by what was happening here.
Right. I should be going to the audience now according to my script, but I have one question before I do that because you've spoken already about the fight that the PPP had with external forces. And you did mention that there were also internal forces collaborating with those external forces. Could we talk a little bit about that?
Well, it came. I think a lot of it came under the pressure of the British wanting to crush the PPP from an early stage. Sillery brought out some things that I didn't know about, that I didn't find in none of Jagan's work or some of the article. I doubt whether he knew about it himself, and I believe he died without knowing some of it. In Sillery's book, with all the information that she had, the evidence that she had, it seems to me that Barnum was probably working with the British even before 1953. Because in 1953, when they were going to the elections, it was expected that the PPP would do well, but none of them were sure if they would have won. I saw recently UC Guyana saying that he knew that the PPP would have won, and he told Chetty and Barnum that it's not a good thing for the PPP to win. But I find that strange. As a politician, you don't fight elections to lose. I don't know, who will fight elections to lose. But I asked Ashton Chase that before he died, because UC Guyana wrote about that before Ashton Chase died, and he said he never heard about that himself at that time. But Barnum, in the Congress before, the year before, he made a play for the leadership. The leader used to be elected by the people at the Congress, but he wanted the Congress just to elect the leaders and then an indirect election, and he hoped he would have won in that way. So he was working at the same time. And according to Sillery, that Jainarayan Singh had said, told them and so forth, told whoever the special branch that, by the way, was established to spy on the PPP. The PPP was formed, the PAC was formed in 1946, and our special branch was established in 1947. So they said that the plan was that Barnum, because there was a lot of independent contesting the elections, the PPP and a lot of independents, so they didn't expect the PPP to do as well as it did. And the plan was that he would have collaborated, he and Jainarayan Singh and Lachman Singh and them would have collaborated with some of the independents and formed the government outside of the PPP, which suggested to me that that idea was planted in their heads by the governor at the time, Savage at the time. And that was the script that they were working on, but it didn't come about because the PPP victory was so big, and that forced Barnum to reveal his hand before the government was formed, when he demanded to be leader or nothing. And 1 week, the party was paralyzed in forming the government, and that, I think, signaled very, even if they didn't have any, even if I'm wrong, and Barnum didn't collaborate with them before, that made it very clear to them that he was ready. He was a low fruit to pick. And the Robinson Commission is the one that said that he should take over the party or split the party. That is why he was never jailed. The people who were jailed was Chetty, Janet, Martin Carter, Sidney King, Rory Westmus, several other middle-level leaders and so forth of the PPP. but Bonham was never touched because they were locking up certain leaders to allow him the time to organize to take over the party. That was how it was done.
So we've spoken about external pressure, we've spoken about internal conflict, internal division. And I'm coming to the audience now to get your input, questions, thoughts, ideas. And the question is, do you think Guyana ever had a fair opportunity to develop politically on its own terms?
President Ramotar, I hope I don't run counter to your, but
Doesn't matter. I could try to answer you.
no, that's all right. I think it's important to deal with context. And the context of the geopolitical environment in which our independence was born is something we cannot ignore. I think, and you and I spoke about this before, and I believe that Chelly Jagan was a very honest, unhypocritical man. And he didn't play games with his ideology and his thinking and his philosophy. And I think he was very frank about the fact that he was left-leaning, communist-leaning with the Eastern Bloc and so on. And he was genuine about it because he genuinely concerned about the poor people, and he thought that communism would help them. And I think that in learning from that, it is where we are today, in that our personal moral compass, like yours, take you down a particular path. My moral compass takes me here. But then our national interests, what is good for Guyana, needs to balance our action. If we operate on our moral compass, particularly and alone, we run the risk of doing what happened to Guyana for the last 35 years or 40 years. And if you think about what happened to us, when I grew up in lodge housing scheme as a young boy, went into national service, went into the army, and Guyana was in a bad place. And it was a bad place because our independence were tampered with. Or our desire for independence and the things we wanted were tampered with by both. You can't deny what the British and Americans did, but you also cannot deny what we did internally, the division that we had internally. And I would just say that I think as we, even now today, in this conflicting world, I would say almost every person that I meet in Guyana have a moral compass that takes us down a path. But our sensibility and our objective reality of the consequence of our personal moral compass could put us in a very dangerous place as a country once again. And so I will end by saying I believe that we must learn from the past and some of the, I don't want to call it mistakes, because in this world there are three types of power. There's hard power, soft power, and smart power. And smart power is about navigating through the difficult geopolitical things that we face in this region. I think we failed to do that when we were attempting to navigate independence. We could have played this game. We could have, I know what Donald said about the British, but we could have played this game, got our political power, without we could never beat the British. I mean, it was foolish to believe that one day we could have a war with the British or somehow win against the British. So we have to understand how to navigate the might of the British and the Western world. Thank you.
What I don't like about the premise of your question is that what you're saying, that honesty is a bad thing. And I don't think that that is true. I think honesty and truthfulness and so forth are virtues. They're not negative things. I hear the arguments in different ways. Not what you said tonight. I've in fact wrote several letters answering some people, the Ramharaks, the Betoram Ramharak, and these Indian nationalists who wanted to turn Jagan as a Bonham, who criticized Bonham, but you could see that they admired him. And they, in fact, I had in one of my replies to one of his letters, I remember saying, he was saying that Jagan was outsmarted by Bonham. I said, Cherry Jagan was never outsmarted, but I will concede that he was betrayed. What took place was a betrayal, not an outsmartedness. The second point I would like to make is that nobody is saying that you must go and pick a fight with a superpower or that. No, and you will be a fool. Any politician will be a fool to want to go and pick a fight with a superpower. But there's an old, to be very simplistic, I remember an old cowboy song I heard where the singer said, my father told me, son, you got to stand for something or you will fall for anything. So principle is don't change necessarily with time. Look at Dr. Jagan's career from 1943. Let's date his political career from 1943 to 1997 when he died. Look at the changes that he went through. Look at him, and he was able to adapt to all the changes, but he stood for principle, and that is why he's Cherry Jagan. So all I'm arguing is that we must stand for principle. There must be some things that we have that is, because if you drift according to who is stronger than who, you're going to compromise your independence and your sovereignty will be compromised. That is what I don't like about the question, and I will answer it by saying, we should be smart, we should maneuver. Jagan himself said so, as if he knew he was going to die. His last Congress speech to the PVP in 1994, he said the PVP is going to come under a lot of pressure now. We'll come under pressure to reform, and we'll come under pressure to do things while. And he said, we can't operate as if nothing has changed, but we must learn to walk between the raindrops. What he was saying there, but we must learn to maneuver. But he went on to add, don't lose your principle. That's the important thing for me. You know, Ho Chi Minh once said, there's nothing more precious than your sovereignty and freedom.
Sure. If there's no more, I just wanted to say that you're right, Donald. Principle and honesty are excellent foundations. But we have a saying in the private sector, we don't reward you for effort. We reward you for results. And the consequence of what happened as we navigate the independence without fully understanding the maneuvering that needed, and you did it, and it was done with pure honesty and principle and so on. Guyana punished for it. The people of Guyana punished. Hold on. The people of Guyana punished for it. In fact, thousands of our citizens hightailed it out of Guyana, end up in Brooklyn and Toronto and Miami, and run away from this country as a consequence of some of the decisions our leaders took in those days. Principled decisions, honest decisions. And I'm just saying that the ends justify the means. And if the ends is to create prosperity for our people, for our young people who needed jobs and agriculture, and there's no doubt that Jagan was probably one of the most popular leaders in the history of this country, followed by Forbes Burnham, of course. But I will go to my grave thinking that he was so honest. You call it outsmarted or betrayed. I said his honesty took him down a path and he didn't confront the challenges that was really ahead of him. And as a result, a lot of Guyanese people punished for it.
I don't agree with you. I think you're blaming the victims. I don't think people left this country because of decision and position. They left the country because exactly what Jagan said in his letter in 1955. If you get into the government with the support of these people, what can you do to transform your country? And our country went into an economic downturn. And that is a lot. The migrants that left Guyana, most of them 90% of them are economic migrants. They weren't political migrants. Although they say Bonham was a tyrant, he didn't kill them before they run. They went because of the economic situation. It wasn't like Chile in that way. So that's one. The second thing, point of what is happening, some of the philosophy that you exposed just now, I think is extremely dangerous. The ends does not always justify the mean, my friend, because that is the mentality of the Israeli for murdering Palestinians and committing a genocide, because their end is to keep expanding Israel to take over the whole. Yeah. And the other point I would like to make is that um, I think I get the drift that okay, we got to look at these people powerful and so we all want to be friends with them, but the cost is what is important. And let us look at what is happening in the Middle East right now. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all of them think that they would have been safe with American bases in their country. Are they safe? No. With all the bases and the military power that they have there, it makes them a target and not necessarily a safe place. So that's just some of the points.
Kurt, could you ask the question again, though, just before I respond to make sure I have the right question?
So the question is, do you think Guyana had a fair opportunity to develop politically on its own terms?
Okay, so I do have a response, but I also had a question that I wanted to ask you. So I guess it's a good time to ask it. Because I would say no. And I wanted to come back to something that former President Ramotar was talking about the way that external forces were able to stoke the racial divide in the 60s. And you had mentioned that a lot of the racialized tensions that were being stoked were happening because of historical dynamics, not as much as the then contemporaneous issues. And what I was thinking in response to that question is, considering the fact that since the 15th century, well, 16th century, when Ghana became colonized and the Dutch came, and the long hundreds of years of history of unhealed and unaddressed trauma, from the genocide of the indigenous people to slavery to indentureship, knowing that in the mid 20th century, when England was losing so many of its colonies because of post-World War dynamics, is it good or thoughtful to think that they were able to sort of pass the traumas of Guyana on to us without ever healing those things? Because by the time that they were able to grant us independence, none of those issues, genocide, slavery, were ever addressed. And so we were not being able to develop as a new country with new issues. We still had all of those untapped, unhealed, unaddressed issues, including those racial anxieties that were able to now manifest in ways, and they were able to say, okay, it's your country now, deal with it. And so my response to that is that we weren't able to begin as our own because we still had all of those centuries of untapped and unhealed issues. And they were able to capitalize on that being unaddressed. We still have not really addressed them. We still see these issues. I mean, you mentioned Palestine and Israel. Those are also centuries old issues that have not been addressed, that are now gestating in very violent ways. And I wonder if it was to the benefit of the British, because of course, for any colonizing power, chaos in the country worked for them. It doesn't matter who's in power. Once chaos is happening, they're able to have this sort of power. And I'm wondering if it's good for us to recognize and think about how the legacy of the pre-independence Guyana being unaddressed in any kind of meaningful way was an added dynamic into the instability of the 60s and the last 6 years of Guyana's existence.
I don't know if I'll answer your question with what I'm going to say, but it takes me back to some of the racial issues that you have. I have a totally different view from most people about the racial problems in Guyana. The theory sounds very simple and it sounds convincing. One of the theory is that when Indians came here, they worked for less money than Africans, and that started the feeling of racism and so forth. But if you go back and look at the history, even when Indians were coming here, even when they came in the most amount, estates were still closing. So it means that, to me, we should at least question that theory, because it wouldn't be that you had a surplus of labor and all of that happening. That something else was wrong. Secondly, if you look from 1838 to 1962, there was never an incident of racial clashes in the country. Even if you go to, what I try to do in order to prove my theory, I go back to read the literature of the time. I can't say I read all of them. Metaholzer, Yankuru, read all of them. And I have never found in any of the classics in our society I haven't found any evidence of any clashes between Indians and Africans. In fact, there was a lot of more stories about people sympathizing with each other. One woman giving evidence of seeing Indian worker being tied under the bottom house of the manager and being beaten. She talked about that gravely, and so forth. So therefore, it is clear to me that this is why I say in our society that race is skin deep, and it is not underpinned by economic values, and it was instigated to destroy the national movement at the time. And people, of course, at that time, our society was much lower level of development. People tend to follow leaders more than they follow ideas and movements and so forth. So we have what we have. So I don't, so with those, I have a very, very different view. And even if you read Walter Rodney, one of the books that changed my view of certain things too, because some people used to write and say that cooperativism was ingrained in the African Guyanese body. And I used to kind of go along with that argument until I read a little booklet by Walter Rodney called From the Nigger Yard to the Village. I think you should read that book. And where he said a lot of the movement of Africans from the estate, and why a lot of them didn't come back to the estate, they saw it more of a status thing to move out of the estate. And you can understand that, being slaves in the field for so many years, and they moved to the village. It was more something like a status issue. It's a very interesting argument that he had put forward. So on the racial issue, I know that there were some other problems that I don't think it was planned for, that had an effect on our race relations. That when slavery was abolished, the African slaves left their estates. Many of them came to the cities, went into the gold bush, and those who went into agriculture went into pig rearing and ground provision farming. When Indians left their estate after indentureship, well, many of them didn't leave their estates because they didn't have much place to go. But those who left their estate, they went into agriculture and went into rice farming and cattle rearing. And the environment was totally different for these two types of employment. And that is why you had different villages where you had probably pure Indians, pure blacks, and so on and so forth. It was, to my mind, more of a employment issue than anything else. And one other point I would like to make in closing this part of my argument. In 1963 or 64, when you had the racial riots was at its height, Dr. Tate, the Tate family who used to live in Kwamina Street, the base there. Dr. Tate, I believe that he was a founder member of the PNC. But he was so disgusted with what the PNC was doing in whipping up racism that he wrote an open letter. He wrote an open letter to Barnum, addressed to Barnum, and saying, what you're doing, you're destroying race relations in this country. And the races were integrating very, very much Buxton was a mixed village in up to 1963, 64. And many of these other villages were mixed villages. My wife used to work at the Sugar Industry Labor Welfare Fund. She resigned about 20 years ago. But up to when she was there, she was still correcting problems of people, Africans who used to live in predominantly Indian area and Indians who used to live in predominantly Indian black area, moving out and exchanging houses on the East Coast in part, East Coast and West Coast in particular, those kind of things happen. So the racial issue, I believe, we need to be confronted with facts and examine what we thought we knew and see how it is. That's why I think it is not impossible to overcome it. And in fact, in some ways, I think the last couple of elections it shows that it is being overcome. And that is one of the reasons too. And coming back to Jerry's question, that is one of the reasons too, I think Dr. Jagan chose a class approach to his problems. Because class, for him, was always more important than race. And he saw that using the class approach was the best way to unify the race towards some of the objectives that we wanted to achieve in our society. And all of the talk, when they talk about communism, the British themselves are saying, Renaissance themselves saying, whatever Jagan believe in, at least what we're doing in Guyana is not communism. All of the reports you will see, you'll find some of those things. The other part of the question was what?
I can't even remember, but but I did want to just do a quick response. Your response is really thoughtful, and I really appreciate it. And I wanted to point out something that you mentioned that I thought was really sharp earlier when you were talking about. You mentioned that the dynamics in terms of how we perceive racism to be, especially within that period, it was the British again stoking lateral hate as a way of keeping persons from, overthrowing the government, like what happens, in Europe. And it happens right now in the US right now also, where, you're going to look at the immigrants as your enemy rather than the persons who's the ruling class. And I was wondering, because I thought the point you made about Mittelhauser and other persons not writing about race, I think perhaps it's possible that these long gestating issues were not really visible because pre 1950s, when independence became a possibility, the idea of us being free of the colonial rulers was a foreign concept. And so when we recognize the closeness of that possibility, the British recognize now that we don't want these people to completely overthrow us. So then it becomes germane for them to be like, before, when we knew that white people were the only persons that would rule us, we had no reason to hate each other. But now that Guyana is a pie that's there for the taking, we're now being encouraged to recognize these differences. So it's not that they were happening in a sort of virulent way before that, but now when it becomes possible for us to jettison the white presence, and we now have to ask who will rule us, and we're now being asked to see the differences in each other, now it becomes a situation where these things that were long latent now become genuine things. And I'm thinking, based on your very good point, that what's happening now is that rather than seeing, again, the British colonizers as the real enemy here, we're seeing each other, because Rodney writes very sharply about how our Caribbean concept of racism is really just repurposing white supremacy. When we call each other these terms, whatever, a black person, an Indian person, and Amerindian person, we really are repurposing white supremacy talking points. And I'm thinking that in this critical moment, and based on your point about the governor's note in his diary, it seems as if they were very aware of what they had maybe planted for a very long time, and they were now sowing that in a way that was to our own detriment.
There's no doubt about it. The British were masters at they were masters at finding differences and exploiting it. Divide and rule in Africa, it was a tribal issue, and the religious issue in India, it was the religious issue, and they always found things to divide and rule. So that is a given, that they never wanted the population to unite, because it doesn't go against them, and it's again to keep bolstering the finance. The money is the big thing there. But why I spoke about the literature, because it's not that they didn't write about race. Mr. Holzer had a little bit of he kind of despised Indians. If you read his books, you kind of he despised Indians, they're nasty, they're this and that and the other. But he never, what the point I was trying to make about that he never pointed out that where you had clashes, or where where the interest was so sharp that you had clashes and problems with blacks and Indians in the society. And that was one of the arguments I had one time in the radio with David Hines, the Black Pudding Man. But I had to tell him, show me in any of our literature that we had, that you find that you had something to divide the population. And most of the society, a lot of researchers, that is one of the methods they use to go to read books of those days. And I can't say that I read everything, but what I read, I didn't find anything to show that the Indians and blacks from the very beginning were separated and divided against each other.
While the discussion is largely and solely on how the British use race to divide and create political instability, I think we should not allow it to escape us, the border issue. It is said that we had the border issue settled in 1899, and it only became a dispute in the early 60s when Dr. Jagan and the PPP were on the verge of bringing about an independent Guyana from British Guyana. That the border issue was stirred up by the American imperialism to create instability in the country. So it's not just the race issue, between blacks and Indians, but I think we talk about external forces. It was the hand of American imperialism to create the border issue as a dispute, or to bring about the border issue as a dispute to create political instability, in Guyana. And if we look around the world, in India independence movement, you got birth of Pakistan, okay, where the country was physically divided, Hindus and Muslim. And even between Pakistan and Afghanistan, a lot of us may not know this, they have border dispute, what they call a Durand line, where the British just draw a line, and the Pashtuns, who are largely Afghani, largely end up in Pakistan. Imran Khan is a Pashtun. And a lot of the Pakistanis are of Pashtun origins. You go in Vietnam, you see the same thing, North and South. Thank God they're reunited now. Korea, North and South until this day. And I think in some African countries also, you would see some kind of a territorial...
Africa is marked up a lot.
Yeah.
The Congo people stretch out not only from Congo, but all the way down to Angola.
So it's not just the creation of the instability, political instability by using race or religion or tribe. It's also territorial instability. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And I want to use this opportunity to say that a key feature of this conversation is really hearing from the persons in the audience. And even though some of your questions, your ideas, and your comments may be in contrast to conclusions that we form here or conclusions that were formed in historical contexts through writings by different people, we welcome them all. I'm also heartened to see the young people in this room, and I encourage you to participate. I know lots of young people were participated when we talked about colonization, and I know politics is a real touchy question. We're talking about division and race, but I encourage you to continue participating in the conversation as we go along this evening. So we're shifting gears a little. While global forces were shaping the direction of the country, something else was happening locally, something equally important. Before many people saw themselves as political actors, they experienced power through work, through labor. How important was the trade union movement in shaping political awareness in Guyana?
It was very important. Um, Critchlow, for instance, played a big role in the very early part of the last century in raising workers begin to try to look at their own interests at that time. And then it had a lull until the 1920s again, when he formed the British Guyana Labour Union. And the British Guyana Labour Union was more than just a union. It had a lot of community links. It had you could see some elements of political demands in them and so forth. Again, an important book, I think, for young people to read if you want to understand about trade unionism is Ashton Chase's book, The History of Trade Unionism in Guyana. And the trade unionism had a big spurt in the 1930s. From 1934 to 1939, throughout the region, you had a lot of uprising, labor uprising. So much so that the British sent a commission, the Moen Commission, to look at what was causing the problems in the Caribbean. And they found the economic situation was the basic cause of the problem, and the things were so bad. But that report was not published in 1939. It was because the war had begun, and the British was afraid. They were afraid that if it fell into the hands of the Germans, and it fell in the hands of Goebbels, who were the great propagandists, that they would have used it against them in a big way. So that was held until 1945. But what the trade unions went a pretty far way to get workers to demand their economic conditions. I saw Lincoln Lewis writing a letter in the paper. I don't know if I'll take him up on it, but let me make this point. That Critchlow went, you can't blame Critchlow. He went as far as he could. That was his limitation was within the trade union movement. But the trade union movement, you find that they will make gains, but then the political system can undermine those gains. That is where Jagan was different, because Jagan not only looked at the economic position of the work thing, but he looked at how do you place the working class in power in order for them to be a class for themselves, and not only to win temporary gains. That's the one aspect I would like to make. The trade union was seen to be so important, and it was because the PPP came out openly that the PPP is a working class party, working people's party, that one thing that the British did that we don't talk about a lot, in 1953, when the constitution of the country was suspended and the PPP was removed from office, the TUC, which was a strongly pro-working class at that time, was disbanded. And in October of 1953, it was disbanded and re-established in December, and it became a tool of the British to fight against the movement at the time. The first thing that it did was to send a message to the British government congratulating them for suspending the constitution in British Guyana. And my problem, and then it was used, the TUC was used as the vehicle for CIA penetration into our country in the 1960s. Now, and that was directly to undermine the foundations of the PPP, since the PPP was a working class party. And the way to do that was racism again played a big role in accomplishing that end. And I believe that is the problem up to this day. That what we have in the labor movement, that same structure that was established by the British remains in place. And it's really there's a desperate need to democratize the labor movement so that they can play their rightful role in our society. But because that is not happening, it is rotting. And because it's not removed, it remains there, and it's becoming practically ineffective. If you compare the private sector with the labor movement used to be very organized. The private sector is far more organized, and therefore they have far more influence in the society than the labor movement at this point in time. And I think that's an issue that really needs to be considered, because I think the TUC is probably one of the most undemocratic organizations and needs democratization so that it could serve the interests of the working people of our country.
You've helped me to connect people, labor, politics. These conversations are about connecting past, present, future. Do you think we've lost that strong connection between labor, people, politics? Do you think we've lost it, or do you think it still exists in some ways?
I don't think we lost it, but I think it wouldn't come about by itself. It has to be organized. There got to be organization. They got to deal with it, and it needs to be organized. Because I'll tell you this: what could happen? That one of the dangers that face our country now is that Guyana is now becoming a big destination for investment, which is good on the one hand, but it will have super exploitation if the labor movement don't put their house in order and get organized, and also to use it to pressure the government that they should make strong statement that these big companies that is coming in the country must recognize trade unions. Jerry and I accompanied Dr. Jagan. He was flying us in. Dr. Jagan invited me in 1990 or 1991. He was invited by Omai to go to Omai to visit. And we went there in Omai. And the big argument he had with the management was, that time Omai didn't have a trade union. He said, you have to have a trade union. Omai was arguing strongly that they only have their trade union like a humbug. And Jagan was very strong against it. And the day he was elected is the day they sent to call in Lincoln Lewis them to be recognized in Omai as a trade union there. I think some of that needs to be done to protect workers and to protect workers' interests in this country.
And more on a reflective tone, do you think that politics was, in fact, I would say, one of the biggest threats to the survival of trade unionism, the labor movement?
You can't separate the two. But of course, it's kind of there's a different labor politics, I believe, that should go across the board. I don't see that me, a PPP, and another person, a PNC, and we belong to the trade union movement, that we shouldn't collaborate in the interests of the working class. That we should adopt, despite what political party we belong to, if we belong to the trade union movement, we should develop a working class politics. And working class needs parliament. I hear a lot of people criticize my friend, in another couple of days, going to be 6 years since he died, Komal Chand, when he was a member of parliament, and saying that he's a member of parliament, he can't represent workers. That's nonsense. Workers must fight to have positions within the parliament in order to establish laws to protect workers. Why are you saying that trade unionists must not go into parliament? But what they should do is make sure that they represent working class interests, and it should go across. They should develop a program with, if you have PNC people who are trade unionists and PPP people, trade unionists and so forth, then they should have try to find common position that we can champion to pressure the authorities that be to have legislation in order to protect working class. In 1957, the first bill that the PPP put in Parliament was Janet Jagan was Minister of Labour, Health and Housing at the time, and she put an amendment to the Workmen's Compensation Law to represent domestic workers who was terribly exploited in people's homes, long hours of work, no holiday with pay, to give them minimum wage and to allow them to have holiday with pay and to amend that. So from the very beginning, the first legislation in 1957 was on behalf of labor. So trade unions got a direct interest in labor. But I think that they should constantly look at what is good for labor and make that above what is good for their party.
That's good. There's a lot that could be said about labor and trade unionism, but when you look at the Guyana today, the Guyana of now, what do you think is the clearest inheritance of that period? What do we still enjoy now that was birthed out of that period?
Well, I think, okay, some of the unions that have survived and are working well, that's a look of that period, right? I mean, only the other day we had Gau's 50th anniversary of being recognized in the sugar industry after a long struggle from the 1940s when it was formed for recognition until 1976 they were recognized. So I think the very fact that they have survived in this time is that. But I think the vast majority of workers in this country are still unorganized. And I still think that that's a big task that the labor movement should be discussing. Instead of petty fighting with letters in the newspaper, they should get down seriously to look at the large amount of working people that remains unorganized, that are exploited. Sometimes I don't know if this still happens. I know it used to happen a lot of time, particularly with saleswomen, sales girls in Regent Street and Water Street at that time, where they were signing for salary that they weren't receiving. And but I don't know if that still happens, but I'm sure that they are being abused in some other ways. Look, some of the problems in the NIS, employers deducting money from workers' wages and not paying in the NIS and so forth. A lot of issues are there that workers need, and if that happens with workers that are organized, you can imagine what is happening to unorganized workers and the kind of pressure that they're coming under. So I would say that the lessons we can take from the past is that organizing the working people is very important at this time.
Yeah. So connecting all of that, colonial structures, independence, external intervention, local mobilization, we begin to see the country both inherited and the country we had to shape. Do you think the challenges we face today are more about the past and less about the present?
I think they're both. I think you cannot deal with the present problems and also to really chart a proper future without having a good understanding of your past. That history is very important. One of the reasons I wrote a letter in a few weeks or months ago in the paper where I was urging the Ministry of Education to teach history, our history, Guyanese history. Even if it's not a CXC examination, you should have it at a local exam and everyone should be able to write it. You cannot, I mean, I hear a lot of people come to me, some of my friends of my age and so forth, come to me and say, you know, the young people didn't understand nothing, they didn't know anything. I said, but it's our fault. It's not the fault of the young people. Whose fault it is? It's our fault. But we can't be able to teach every single person. The school system can help a lot. And I understand, subsequently I heard that Belize has, in their school, they're teaching their own history. And if you want to take Caribbean history, you can take it. But your Belize history is important for them. I think the same thing should happen in our society. where our schools should start teaching our own history. And that was recognized in the early PPP, when Brindley Ben was Minister of Education in the 1950s. He started what was called in 1958, he started the Guyana, this month in October, they had History and Culture Month. Because one of the tasks of the PPP was to re-educate the people in their own history. Because when I went to school and studied the 1763 uprising, the Dutch governor was the hero and not Coffee when you study that. So therefore, we needed to study it from our perspective, our point of view. And the PPP started that, and they had even set up a big committee. I have the names of the people before they came out of government in 1964, and all of that work stopped, where they were setting up a committee to look at writing textbooks for the schools, both primary and secondary school, to study our own history. I think that they need to go back to that so that nobody will tell me the young people they know nothing but what happened in the past. Because it's not their fault. It's not their fault that they're born after us. It's our fault that we're not teaching them about it. Yeah.
Your call for history to be taught more in schools was also a call made by Dr. Adams during our last conversation. So I appreciate that. And bringing across a question that I'd asked then, I'll ask now. Are we consciously building something new today or unconsciously repeating patterns that we already set, that were already set?
You put me on the spot. I don't know how to answer. I think it's both ways. I think there's no way we can escape our past. It still has its imprint on us. But in our society is moving rapidly, developing quickly. The transformation is taking place before our eyes. And that is why I think it's important that ordinary people have to organize themselves and have the opportunity to kind of shape it in a way that benefits them and don't only benefit a small group of people, particularly a small group of expatriates. I saw in the paper today headline that we're getting great benefit from ExxonMobil by organizing a little cricket match and so forth.
But
You know.
but where is the blueprint for the development now coming from? Where's that blueprint?
No, but there are, I think the government, there's several documents you could find. I mean, you had this job. It started with Dr. Jagan before he died, and then I think former President Jagdeo took it a big way where he had major consultation with, and we had that document. That document, I think it needs to be revised now with all that is taking place in our society. Probably needs to be revised. That is where I think the Parliament and many of the select committee can play a big role in organizing people to look. There are blueprints and there are plans about how things are going, but I believe that by the time that we found oil, that the reality started to move faster than what we had in plans. And from that point of view, I think they need to be relooked. But there are a lot of good policy documents that exist within the system, and some of which I still think is being followed.
Rewinding down our discussion, and I'm coming back to the audience. Based on what you've heard, what do you think Guyana still needs to change at a structural level, not just politically, to move forward? What do you think Guyana needs to change at a structural level, not just politically, to move forward?
I think TEDx Turkine or our volunteer team might have to do some advocacy for this history to be taught in schools as the first thing, because this is what it's exposing to us. And that's exactly why we organized this conversation, because we recognize the importance of having them. And on the point of education, and to your question, Kurt, I am a huge advocate for a reform of our education system, like a serious reform. And I might have said this before because I feel like I keep saying it, so bear with me. But I think our education system as it is, and there have been efforts to make small reforms, but not comprehensive enough. when we think about why our education system was structured or put in place, what exists right now, why, what were they trying to produce, what are the type of people that they were trying to produce, in both in their ability to think or work, or like the roles that they identified for us. I think largely that's still there. And when we think about the Guyana we want moving forward, you cannot do any real engineering without restructuring the type of people, the type of people we're producing every single day through our education system. At home, we have a literacy program where you have children who cannot read, for instance, and we have policies at education, at the Ministry of Education level, that talks about automatic promotion and no child left behind and all of these things. We have a serious literacy problem in this country. And then at the level of University of Guyana, we have free education, and that's great, except we have huge portions of people who will never get there because there's no real intentionality to do that kind of work. And I made a criticism the other day about that we don't think big as a people, and that's because our system was structured entirely to produce a certain set of, like, a certain mindset of people. We are afraid sometimes to think big. We have this idea that we're not maybe as smart as when look at our people interaction with foreigners, and you'll see. I have worked in an oil and gas company, and you can see the interaction of the people when they engage a foreigner. It's like we still have this smallness about us, and so that needs to be unlearned. And it starts, yes, at school, and it has to be intentional. So I mean, we can go on and on, but for me, if I were to pick one thing, I would say comprehensive reform of our education to produce the kind of people, skills, thinking for the next chapter of Guyana.
If I may say, I think a lot is being done in education. If you look at the budget and look at the gold program, I don't agree with all of the gold program. I think, okay, you can have it, but I think more emphasis should have been put. A lot more of that money should be going to UG and developing UG and making it a more powerful institution. I want to urge many of you to go back and read Dr. Jagan's speech at the opening of UG. He was out of the country when UG was opened in 1963. His speech was read by Brindley Ben, who was the deputy premier at the time, to see what vision he had for UG and to ask ourselves, I think those views that he had for UG were very laudable stuff. He wanted to create a new type of intellectual. He didn't just want to bring an intellectual that was bright and do the work and work for plenty money and call for the same money like the white man to get in and go for holiday in England and so forth. He wanted to develop an intellectual whose sympathies will be with the grassroots. It's an important speech, I think. And just before he made that speech, I stumbled on another speech that he made at a graduating class for the Technical Institute, both of which I think should be read to see the ideas that he had. A lot of it has gone through the window, and UG is just another institute. One of the reasons he didn't want to tie UG with the University of the West Indies, because he felt the University of the West Indies was a colonial project. It was developed by the British. Guyana University is the only university that was developed by a colonial people first. And he had a totally different view of what the university to be to what it actually turned out to. And I would urge you to read that speech, those two speeches of him.
Before I just indicate by a hand, I just wanted to kind of say that I hope I'm wrong about this, but I do have a feeling that some of the things that we talked about, the intervention by the British, even the US, and the things that we know that are necessary to change are not being changed because now we have a new set of elites who are benefiting from it. And like the conversations that we need to have, the history that's not being taught, like all of these things, the structural things that remain largely unchanged. I want to be very wrong about this, but I do believe that largely because there was a subset of people who continue to benefit from that lack of change, and there's little to no incentive to do the change. So our own people have now become our colonizers in a sense. But I will please. This is just I said I hope I'm wrong about it, although I suspect I'm not. Anybody else?
Okay, I wanted to respond to, well, Janelle's point and former President Ramotar's response, and a question that I had also that I think kind of ties up. I was really happy to hear you mention that thing about UG, because I am a former UG lecturer, and I do remember quoting some of that initial speech in a paper on campus when I was talking about my own concerns about the way that education and academia have moved towards capitalistic dynamics that are very often not in sync with the essence of where UG started and the value of it being a university started by colonized people. And that point on capitalism, like I always say that capitalism is the gift that the US gave to the world post World War II. I mean, that has become the mode of living around the world right now. It's the global dynamic of living. And so I wanted to come back to something I'd written earlier in your speech I wanted to talk about that I think kind of ties up the capitalistic influence of the US and other imperialist nations on this region. I was happy when the moderator brought up the point about Guyana as a Cold War battleground during the 1950s. And I'm happy it came up because some of us would know that one of the main reasons that the British lost their territories over the next 30 years after World War II is because they were healing from the destruction in World War II. And a major reason that they were anxious about Guyana was their fear of us becoming a new Cuba and their fear of, the big red scare and communism. And you did point out, of course, that we were not really moving as a communist country, we were a socialist country. And I think it's interesting, and I would love to hear your thoughts also on looking at the line of history from the 1950s to now. We still hear these words like communism and socialism being very scary buzzwords in Western countries, especially the US right now. As soon as somebody hears, oh, this is a socialist something, the government shouldn't be, funding hospitals or funding libraries. And looking at the way that capitalism has become the mode of development for developed nations, every developed country is being encouraged to follow capitalistic pursuits. And in the case of universities, we're not looking at building a holistic cultural education. We're looking at value for money. That pops up. I mean, I've had that struggle as head of department where I was trying to push back against some of those limitations because that's not how education really should be functioning, but that is how donors are operating. And I'm wondering, looking at the history of the last 60 years and looking ahead to the next 60 years, seeing where we are now globally in terms of how socialistic principles are being fear-mongered against in this region, in the global south, in the wider world, what are your concerns about where we might be going, and what kind of hopes or blueprints do you have for us to sort of resist that trajectory and maybe work towards what Janelle is pointing out of having a focus on education and these systems that are not about, value for money, but something more socialistic and cultural and hopeful beyond just money?
If I may say that part of the big problem in the left movement is that particularly since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they've become very dispersed and very weak. Organization, I think, is the problem that they have. Many of them get caught up in what probably it's important issues for some people, but for me, I don't think it's the most important issue. What sex the person is, if it's male or female, or what all kind of thing you're hearing. Some people think those things are important, but to me, I don't think those are the most important things. And the need to do that. But if you want to look at the dangers that capitalism is posing in our world today, just take the environmental issue. into consideration. And you will see that despite the fact that we know what we're doing is destroying the world and can lead to a catastrophe, the logic of capital is taking us to the precipice. And the push, I mean, if you think, for instance, let's take, for instance, the cigarette. I used to smoke. I stopped a long time ago. But the company knew for decades that cigarettes was causing cancer, and they stifled it. The oil companies know that what they're doing is causing great changes in our but they got a president in the United States who totally against alternative energy. And so what is very clear is that the system needs to be changed or at least to be reformed. But there's a weakness in organization in getting it done. It is very, very clear. But at the same time, I think we got to be realistic about how you change things. That we don't. I think a lot of socialist experiments failed because people feel that when you make a revolution, that tomorrow you in government you got a socialist country, and that leads to a lot of disasters, a lot of disasters that lead to. It led to a disaster even in China, which started to correct it from the late 1970s, and now the fastest growing economy and probably the growing standard of living is in a socialist society, China. Now, so much so, China is so successful that a lot of capitalist countries say it's capitalism over the China. So I would say that there are several things that you could look at to show that the system has outlived its usefulness. Not that it wasn't useful, but you don't have the force to change it. And that is why we have all of these wars taking place. That's at the root of the cause of what is going on in Iran and Israel. Israel is a different case now. There are and a lot of other places that things are happening.
I think this is the last. Two more questions.
On the question of blueprints, I know the Carter Center, working with other stakeholders in Guyana, in the 90s, after the 92 election, they came up with a national development strategy, quite a comprehensive document. And it was, in my view, seen as the Bible.
That was updated under Jagdeo.
No, so I just want to know, you get your view. Mention was made about the blueprint. How much of that is still part of the developmental trajectory of the economy now? And just one more point I want to add on this UG thing. I don't know how many of us know that University of Guyana started at QC. After the day class in the evening, and the critics, and I would even say the cynics, dubbed it as Jagan Night School.
Quickly on that score, I haven't familiarized myself recently with some of the things there, but I think a lot of what is there probably is achieved. I'm not sure, and I think it needs to be looked at again in light of where our economy is going now and the speed at which it is going. And about the what you said about UG starting at Queen's College is true, but that's not the only thing that was very creative at the time. When the PPP got in government in 1957, they also was fighting against illiteracy. And after schools, they were using some of the schools to teach people, give people to write the exam, GCE exam at the time. Bishops was one of the places they were using, and also to teach other things to people, like the domestic violence and so forth that we still have plaguing us, They were talking to people about the causes of domestic violence and the equality of women and all of that. A lot of good work was being done in using those buildings instead of just closing them up at 3 o'clock to use them for other good purposes.
Yeah. So, Kurt, I'm very sorry that the format you used in asking the audience a question to respond, that's very new. So, I'm sorry, but I had questions of my own I wanted our former president to answer. As a student of politics at UG, I know some people would point to positions like the general secretary, which you once held. Uh, Associated with the People's Progressive Party and associate those with communist parties in China, Cuba, etc. To what extent that's a fair comparison? And I would like to know how would you define the PPP's ideological position today?
But fortunately, I don't have to do that. The PPP has done that at the last Congress. That they said that Marxism, Leninism is no longer the only ideology of the party, and they're embracing ideological pluralism. So they can tolerate me still as a Marxist, while they will have other type of ideology within the party itself. So that is the answer for that. What was the first part you wanted to say?
So yeah, just the general secretary, that one, because other political parties in Guyana, they would have like a leader, but
Okay.
yeah.
Well, the PPP started with the leader. Most of the political parties in Guyana were patterned themselves after the British system. So when the PPP started, it had leader, chairman, general secretary. And that went on until 1970. In 1970, the party took, 1969, the PPP took a decision after the rigging of the 1968 elections, right? When it was clear that the PNC was not going to give up government by the ballot box. And it was felt that we may have eventually to fight for power in this country. And we thought at that time that the type of party that the PPP was, a mass loose party, would not have brought that success. And we wanted a more tight, disciplined party. So in 1969, they took a decision to transform the party. And in 1970 Congress, which was held at Anna Regina in the Essequibo, that decision was confirmed that we were going to make the party, it might become smaller, but tighter, and more unified, more disciplined, and so forth, to fight for power. Fortunately, we didn't have to end up in a armed fight for government. That the struggle that PPP led and joined by others later eventually ended up that we won elections by the ballot box, which was, thank God for that, that we didn't have to do. But it was important, I think, because I don't think that without that transformation, we would have been able to remove the PNC in 1992.
And another one I have, really coming into this conversation, I thought it would have been more about Guyana's political history. So I know we started with the 1960s and we went back to the labor movements we had. And I was looking for us to come down to probably the 1970s, 1980s, 90s, etc. So
I would love to do that, but
Yeah.
probably another time.
Yes, and I think time too. Time. We would have to have like 10 hours. But looking back at the late 1970s and early 80s, there were competing narratives about the roles of the Working People Alliance, who was a party that sprung up that time. How do you think Guyana arrived at a more unified understanding of that history, especially for the younger generation?
I think when the WPA was formed, they were formed at a period of time that was very conducive for them. You remember Walter Rodney came back to Guyana in 1974 after the rigging of the 1973 elections. the PNC was losing support so rapidly that they had to use the army to seize the ballot boxes and put themselves in power again. So, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction. So I think that they started at the right time. Because if you look at what Walter Rodney said, he was never saying anything different than what Jagan was saying. But what was different, that it was now being said by a black person, that was the danger to the PNC. That was the danger, because the PNC rode on the backs of race by frightening the masses. That if it's not me, you're going to get the Kudi man going to come, and he's going to discriminate against you, and he's going to do all kind of things against you. They couldn't do that with Rodney, because Rodney was African guy. And I think that is why Rodney didn't join the PPP as well. Rodney is a historian, and he studied revolutions. And I think he studied the Cuban Revolution very well. Fidel Castro was a Marxist. His brother Raul was a Marxist. But they didn't join the Communist Party of Cuba because anti-communism was so high and poisoned people's mind that even when you say communism to somebody, or socialism, as the comment was saying here, it's like waving a red flag to a bull. So they didn't join. And they had the 26th of July movement. They worked with other forces, and they got the government in 1959. I think that was the model that Rodney was looking at. That if he had joined the PPP, Bonham would have said that he's a Kudi stooge and tried to make him ineffective. So in a way, Rodney assassination was a racist assassination as well. And I think that was he draw that lesson. And I think the other mistake that they made, my own view, is that the initial successes that they had, they didn't consolidate. Instead, they decided to go more full out, more push, more harder and harder, instead of consolidating and tightening the party. And they were so infiltrated that he ended up to getting assassinated. And that is the PPP's transformation in 1970. I didn't say that they were not penetrated too, but they were less penetrated, and it was more difficult to penetrate the PPP than to penetrate the WPA. And that is why the WPA eventually was destroyed. And now they joined the PNC.
I hear Janelle saying time. And the truth is, we can spend all evening speaking on the political formation of Guyana. And this part of the discussion is rightfully titled Part 1. So there's more to come on this. But in closing, because I'm not going to ask any more questions, tonight's conversation asks a simple but difficult question. Was independence enough? And what we've explored is that while independence changed the form of Guyana, it may not have fully changed its structure. That structure was shaped by colonialism, influenced by global power, and built through local struggle. And so if the past was not accidental, then the future cannot be either. It must be understood, it must be examined, and it must be consciously shaped. Thank you, Mr. Ramotar, and I give the mic back to Janelle. Thank you all.